We come to Ritual 1, and we're using the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Analects of Confucius to begin. This is a fold-out page illustrating the 183rd chapter of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And it appears in this elephant folio volume, published at the end of the 1890s by the British Museum. It is the fourth volume in this size of elephant folio. And the original one was the great papyrus of Ani that had been recovered by British Museum operatives. At this time, the British Empire spread across the entire world with tremendous amounts of money and contacts. And in this heyday, the number one person in the world who went out to find artifacts and bring them back to London was Sir E.A. Wallace Budge. And I like his version of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, though many people today prefer more modern translations. The reason being that the Egyptian Book of the Dead has a number of variants, and the largest complete papyrus that was recovered, the papyrus of Ani, was 78 feet long by about 1 1/3 feet high. And when it came time to publish that, Budge figured out the format to cut the papyrus roll into 37 double sections so that they could be folded over, and where the tape was on the fold, that tape extension would be sewn into the signature of the book so that you would be able to have the sheets open without anything in between, a complete flat area. We're going to come back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead in detail after we talk about Confucius for a while. But what we're trying to do here is to appreciate how a ritual comportment is the practical action of getting something made. So that rituals are all about objectivity. Every ritual leads somewhere, and where it leads to is not so much a place or a time or a situation, but it is an emergence of the unity of existence. So that ritual is all about an existential objectifying to emerge that out of the flowing powers of nature, and that as it emerges in a ritual, man's activity of doing the rituals right, so that now rituals that are done right become R-I-T-E, they become rites. And those rights are the basis of law, which then structure the way an existence will be unified and real and have emerged out of primordial nature in such a way that if we follow those rights precisely, accurately, the experience that will come out of having done those rituals right will have a harmony with nature. That the flow of the mythic horizon of experience will be exactly like the flow of the divine flowing nature, and that these two flows together will have an ability to have a configuration. And what will hold that configuration configured will be the figures of the rituals done right. And so rituals are all about making a practical objectivity come into being such that our participation in making them gives them a double face. One face will be the actual emergence out of nature. The other face will be the ability to emerge experience out of the ritual. And that those three together now will be the beginnings of form in the actual universe, and will be crowned or capped by a symbolic mind which will finish the integral, which will finish the form. And that those three phases will constitute the beginning triangle, the beginning triad. And when you add the fourth phase, you now do not add just one more phase, but you pair two triangles together to make a square, to make a frame of reference, to make a picture that will hold in its stability with its four angles and four sides. This is a standard way of comporting. And you notice that we have used phases rather than subject matter. Rather than saying we're studying anthropology, or we're studying archaeology, or we're studying geography. We are not studying anything. We are learning how to learn. And because we have already been immersed in too much studying over our lives, we need to recalibrate from studying to learning. And the recalibration to learning means weaning ourselves away from a recognizable instruction, a comfortable training, and moving out into a new realm. And this new realm will be the recalibration to learning rather than the regimentation to studying. Because the regimentation to studying is eventually based upon the logic of identity and identification, where the ritual objects will be exact reference to the symbolic idea in the mind. This already was obviated 5,000 years ago, when an Egyptian God appears. That god or that goddess will have many names. Each name will be a single attribute, so that the more attributes that one is able to see in that divinity, the more facets that divinity will have for you, and eventually will be like a jewel that scintillates and develops a kaleidoscopic appreciation in you for the divine. Whereas if you go for an identification that this God has this name and is this object, this ritual, all of this lumped together, you get a reductionist quality to your understanding. The mind then gunks itself up instead of learning to see through itself to the kaleidoscopic consciousness of vision. It only sees in terms of the identity of the seer and the identifications that the seer is able to make, and that this reductiveness closes out the vitality of the world. It sutures our ability to participate in nature, and it inarticulates by crimping our ability to have primordial experience. We began by looking at this example of the 183rd chapter of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There is a very nice translation of it. This volume, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, published by Chronicle Books about 12 years ago. The man who put this together, James Wasserman, was riding on a New York subway and had this sudden vision occur to him. Why not take the entire Papyrus of Ani and put the very best translation of modern times underneath it so that one could look through it page by page and be able to see the correlation of the text with the illustrations. And the translation of the 183rd section of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, worshiping Osiris, giving praise to him, in homage to Wenifer, doing obeisance to the Lord of the sacred land, exalting him who is on his sand by whoever the person who has been buried, who is being introduced, and is being introduced to Osiris, the Lord of the dead, the Lord of the underworld, of the netherworld. But before that, the Egyptian Book of the Dead will have a series of hymns. Those initial hymns are to Re, they're to Ra, they're to the sun god. They are characterized in the way in which these are transcribed. The very first, the worship of Re when he rises in the eastern horizon of the sky by Ani, so that the dead man, Ani, is beginning by praising Re, who rises in the east and who goes across the sky in a celestial boat, and when it comes time to set in the west, the setting in the west will be, for the ancient Egyptians, always the entrance into another quality of that boat that goes through the netherworld and comes back into dawn and rises again. So that the sun has a boat that has two facets, has two names. One of them is able to go across the sky, the other is able to go through the nether world and come back up. When one completes the journey across the sky and Re comes to the entrance to the netherworld, this is the beginning of the realm of Osiris. And so the initial hymn to Re reads, "Hail to you, having come as Khepri, the scarab who releases the sun in its boat for the day. Even Khepri, who is the creator of the gods, you rise and shine on the back of your mother, the sky. Having appeared in glory as king of the gods, your mother, Nut, shall use her arms on your behalf in making greeting." The goddess Nut is very often portrayed as black, a black woman whose body is covered with stars and with the paths of the sun and the moon. When it is daytime, she has been raised far enough above so that the sun is able, in its boat, to concourse between us and the sky. And when Re goes into the nether world, now Nut shines as the night sky universe. And she originally was in a love-making with the god of the earth, Geb, and from them came the ability to have a special fertility on the earth, except that there was a very special curse that came when she was separated from Geb by Shu, who lifted her up with one hand on her lips, the other hand on her vulva, and lifted her up so that she could no longer be with Geb, the earth, the god of the earth. And part of the curse was that she was not ever to have a child on any day of the year. But it was Thoth who, like the ancient Sumerian Enki, was brilliant about getting the analytical special details of the universe, and he found that if you compute by moons rather than by the sun, you will have 5 extra days in a year, which will not fit into the sun's year and will be outside of the set of the curse. And on each of those 5 days, Nut sired by Geb 5 children: Osiris, Set, Horus, Isis, and Nephthys. It is this quality in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that, lurking behind what seemed originally to those Europeans in the early 19th century that first became aware of hieroglyphics and of the ability to struggle to make a translation of them, all based on Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in the early part of the century. The quality that was there, that came out, was that at the very beginnings of written civilization, already the cosmology was extremely refined and resonates and lingers throughout the rest of civilization even till our time. Hieroglyphic writings of the Egyptian Book of the Dead were used up until the 1st century AD. One of the little resonances that might be of interest to you from the 17th chapter of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the chapter of praises and gloryings of coming forth by day, in which the primal water god, the god of the abyss, reveals that there was a mutilation of Ra, reveals that the eye of Ra was attacked by Set, and that part of the difficulty that came out was that there were 7 spirits that were set to corral the ability of the movement of reality. Homage to you, O ye lords of right and truth, ye sovereign princes who stand round about Osiris, who do away utterly with sins and offenses, and who are in the following of the goddess Hatshepsut, grant ye that I may come to you, destroy all the faults which are within me, even as you did for the 7 spirits who are among the followers of their Lord Sipa, that is Osiris. So when we read in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus cast out 7 devils from Mary Magdalene, it meant that he, as an Osiris person, having special relationship with her, freed her from the entire heptamad of cursed spirits that are possible even against the sun, Re, but are mitigated not in the day of Re circulating the sky, but in the nether world by Osiris, because he has not just the ability for Re to keep his reality all the way through the day in his boat and his other boat aspect at night in the netherworld and come back, but Osiris has died, has been dismembered, and has been brought back together again, and so he is a double quality of divinity. He has, in fact, two very distinct paired names and qualities. One of them translates as Lord of Eternity. The other translates as Lord of Everlastingness. The Osiris, who is the Lord of Eternity, is within the ceaseless flow of nature before time occurs, before space occurs, before any kind of limitation occurs. But he also is able to translate being Lord of Eternity into being Lord of Everlastingness through his resurrection. So that one now, even though you are in time, limited by time, limited not just by time as a flow, but by time forms, you are free to permeate through the liminals of time forms of any duration, of any size. And the first penetration is that having successfully gone through the netherworld, along with the entourage of Re, but through 12 gates, each gate having a watcher, a keeper of that gate. And each keeper of that gate will address you with certain problems, certain riddles, certain difficulties, which you must be able not just to respond to, but to solve them. Because just to respond to them would get you into an argument and you would never get through the gate. You would be stopped by your ability to argue. Whereas if you dissolve the issue, one can pass through, and if one passes through all 12 gates, and the spaces in between them in ancient Egypt were called caverns, if one can go through all of the caverns and all of the gates, you will be able to rise with Re the very next dawn. And the name in Egyptian for the Book of the Dead, Per Hru, means coming forth by day. Once one can come forth by day, one can come forth by day for millions of years and into time cycles that exceed the ability for time forms to be formed. One now has an everlastingness that is also partakes of eternity. But the vehicle for that is a transform that Osiris provides. And Osiris provides it because he has had two very powerful helpers. One is Isis, who is always paired in special rituals with Nephthys, her sister. Because Nephthys secretly, though she was married to Set, had a child also by Osiris, and Nephthys and Isis together are like a special tuning fork where the power of Set to go against Osiris permanently has been obviated because Nephthys is with Isis, her sister, and they protect together. But what is difficult to appreciate and to understand in the Egyptian Book of the Dead is how Osiris sits on a judgment throne, but one cannot get further from him until you have gone through a special ritual that is overseen by Thoth, so that Osiris is surrounded by Isis and Nephthys and by Thoth. And what Thoth does is that he provides the very refined special ability not only to compute by the moon, so Thoth is a moon god, and his very first moon is still today called the Isis moon, the thinnest little sliver of light on the moon. And when it's that slight, that Isis moon will show the whole of the moon illuminated in a lighter blue. And that lighter blue is because of the earth shine. Just like we have moonshine on earth, we have earth shine on the moon. And it's the Isis moon that is like the special ring where the first little sliver of light still shows the wholeness not of the dark of the moon, but of the earth light moon. And it is this mystical Isis moon that you will find, for instance, in William Blake's great 100-plate epic Jerusalem. He will have this great Stonehenge-like trilithon and the Isis moon above it, and it's the sign that there are still ancient Britons like the spirit of William Blake in 1825 who still could see that the Isis moon is not the dark of the moon, but it's the earth-lit moon, which is the first beginnings that Re is not only rising over the earth, but he is rising, illuminating the moon as well. And we're given to understand that in a very real way, the earth and moon together form like a double planet that have a very special kind of a quality. The moon lends a kind of magical difference to the solar aspect, in that the lunar aspect is one of rebirthing in everlastingness in time. Re does not rebirth in time because he does not die. But Osiris has died and has come back. And so the Osirian rituals are all about the powers of getting through Osiris's judgment throne and into the process. And the very first aspect of getting into the process of going through the 12 gates of the 12 caverns is that your heart must be weighed. And the weighing of the heart, the Greek term for it that has been used now for all the time since Pythagoras, is psychostasia. And the weighing of the heart is tabulated by Thoth and overseen by Anubis, who was the child that Osiris had with Nephthys. And because of his special jackal-headed godship, Anubis is able to take from the headdress of the goddess of truth, Maat. He is able to take the ostrich plume and place it exactly on a very delicate, exact scale that Thoth has set up. And that scale will balance the ostrich feather of the goddess of truth against your heart. And if they are in balance, you are able to go into the journey of the netherworld because you're considered ready to try. If your heart is heavier than the ostrich plume of Maat, you are immediately fed to a very gruesome little beast, Emmet. And Emmet likes to gobble things up. He's like a Ghostbusters gobbler. Now this is interesting because the first 3 double pages of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the first one are the hymns to Ra, the second, the hymn to Osiris, the third is the weighing of the soul, of the heart, of the psychostasia. What we're given to understand is that the heart is indeed the center, not of intelligence, but the center of sentience. And that experience is not so much intelligent in that it is sentient. And it means then that the sentience is not a part of a structure of the mind, but a part of the concourse of the energy of the heart. And so experience is a flow of heart energy. It has a special frequency as an energy, and if that frequency, that energy of heart experience is able to modulate with the eternal quality of the frequency of nature, then in that flow you're able to go through the psychostasia and to participate then in all of the challenges that will come up, and you will rise at the end. The Egyptian Book of the Dead originally did not appear in books, but appeared on the inside of pyramids. This is the earliest one, the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid of Unas, of Wenet. And this appears in a set of books published by the Bollingen series, Alexander Piankov, and his helper in this was Natasha Rambova. Now it'd be interesting to you, just as a little sidelight, Natasha Rambova, in many of the volumes, but especially in the mythological papyri, was one of the deepest spiritual appreciators of ancient Egyptian wisdom ever to have lived. And in this volume on mythological papyri, the text, she has an entire section on the symbolism of the papyri. And what is curious is that Natasha Rambova was famous because she was the wife of Rudolph Valentino, and that she spurred Rudolph Valentino and went into a lesbian relationship with a very famous woman. And this is a little bit from a biography. Natasha's name seems to be of some controversy. Her mother, Winifred Kimball, was of the prominent Mormon Kimball family, who gave birth to Natasha out of wedlock, and the father's name was never known, and there were 4 men who claimed to be the father of Natasha Rambova. Winifred married a man named Michael Shaughnessy, and she became known as Kimball Shaughnessy, depending on her wibsy, but her birth certificate does not carry this. She later was adopted by her mother marrying a second man, Richard Hudnut, who was a very famous man in his day. And in 1923, her marriage to Rudolph Valentino proved to be ineffective because the glamour of the Hollywood of Valentino seemed to her increasingly to be a mirage, because her own spiritual development was so poignant that seeing firsthand the stupid play of this mirage enmeshing people led her increasingly to try to find what is all this about, what is the quality of reality that one could find. She was a spiritualist. Her huge labors in Egyptology won international praise. She died at the age of 69 in Pasadena of scleroderma, a disease that dries up the inner organs. So that symbolically, she died the death that an Egyptian mummy would be treated to after death, where the inner organs are brought out and put in the little jars, and the brain and blood and everything drained from the body. And so a desiccated mummy, and she became this actually in real life at her death. She writes, "The root pattern illustrated in the scenes of these papyri is that of the eternal repeating cycle of the sun god. His emergence from the watery abyss at the dawn of each new creation, his descent in the west into the necropolis of the western mountain, his passage through the night regions of Osiris, his rebirth from the horizon of the eastern mountain, re-ascent back into the heights of heaven." And then she goes on from there. And what we're to understand from this, Re is the ascent of the day heading towards the descent into the netherworld. But Osiris is the descent into the underworld heading for the ascent back into everlastingness. Re carries eternity, but Osiris carries everlastingness. So that for those of us who are in time, who are in space, Osiris is the key to us. If we are able to go through the netherworld cycle, Re will carry us into eternity in the coming forth by day. There is no problem with Re carrying us eternally. The challenge is to go through the rebirth, the resurrection challenge, which has its own portion. Like there are 12 hours to the day, there are 12 gates in the netherworld. The difficulty is that the netherworld gates are a set. They're not just a string of challenges. It's not just a sequence of gates, but it is a very refined nesting of each one into the next. And so you have to have the ability to raise ordinarily your spiritual energy as you go through, and you will have achieved the spiritual energy on a high enough level to be with Re. You will have achieved Re energy after the 12th gate and be able then to rise with Re, not that he's carrying you, but you rise with him. You have achieved the eternity of the Godhead in your own right, in your own person. We're going to take a little break, but I want to show one more little illustration. Here is Ani laying supine in his coffin, and Horus the hawk flies over him. And what is being carried here is the Shen, the symbol of eternity. But this Shen, where it is flat, has a name seal. And it will have the name of whoever is here in this ritual of resurrection. In this case, Horus carries the Shen with the name of Ani. And it is this name that will be the signature on the hymns to Re and to Osiris, and will call forth then that it is your heart that is being weighed by the ostrich feather of Maat, so that there is no mistake whatsoever. This carrying of one's name on a symbol of eternity already puts you in the tuned mode that you will be successful. What would then be the problem remaining? The problem remaining is that you remember what you have learned. Because if on the way you forget, it's all over. Amit will have you for breakfast, for a supper. And so remembering is the essential quality of reaching everlastingness and eternity. And it is remembering that is a special quality of thought. Let's take a break. Let's come back and look at something that has emerged that is very important for us. And that is objectivity in the universe is not static. It has its emergence into objectivity out of a limitless source that does not have an encoding at all. So that it would appear to anything that is encoded as not being there. What happens is that the unlimited natural flow, the energy, would occupy the interstices between things and the intervals between units of time, so that there would be no way to identify objectively anything that is real in the sense that it has nature naturally operative in it. All that would record is the reduced forms. So that identification is a deception in itself. And assuming the prejudice that you have an identity is like compounding what was an illusion into a delusion. So to insist on identity as the basis of a logic of form is an illusion, and to further insist that you are an identity that can make these identifications is a delusion. How then to wean away from what is a double bind? The only way to wean away from the delusion is not to have the illusory basis for it in the first place. Once a delusion sets in, it is self-confirming because it will always use the method of identity as a logical structure and the practice of identification that existential things are reference to the mind's things. What emerged this morning out of looking at the Egyptian Book of the Dead is that it is not a question of reference in logical identification, but of a participation of resonance with the energy calibration of unlimitedness. And the only experience, energy calibration that will modulate with that is the modulation of time forms that are everlasting. It's very difficult to do it in between the forms of space. It is much easier to do it in terms of the forms of time. And so, being able to recognize that it is uniting time that creates the initial seed of the illusion that is the beginning of the possibility of the deeper delusion later on. So that the Lord of everlastingness, that is Osiris, is indeed a very deep complementarity to the eternal Lord of eternity, that is Re. So Osiris is Lord of millions of years to expand the sense of time units beyond what a mind could keep track of in any kind of identification way. You can keep track of days, weeks, months, years. You can even keep track of centuries and of millennia and maybe even 10,000 years. You cannot keep track of millions of years. It's not possible. It does not form in the mind because the scalar goes off. Were you able to count that high to millions of years, you would now be bringing in other aspects that are not just, quote, local. They're not just in the star system, but they're in our star system vis-a-vis the heavens themselves. Because on the scalar of millions of years, it is the motion of the galactic arms themselves that enter into the energy play, into the vibrations. And so the entire star system, the sun, the moon, all the planets, are now being affected, really, by the motion of the galaxy itself. The first step towards that incomprehensibility was the farthest that could be kept track of was a period of the sun going through the constellations of the ecliptics over about 25,900 years, the Great Year, was as large a scalar of time intervaling that could be kept track of before the age of science and supercomputers. Now we have to keep track of very large scalars indeed, whole universes, which we can do. It's not just to boggle the mind, but it is to outdistance the ability to measure time. So that the only way that one can deal with it now is not in some kind of an idea, mentality, referential to things, but to modulate the cycles of experience with the natural eternity. And the only cycle that fits that is everlastingness, the cycle of everlastingness. The phrase at one time was world without end. Yes, this world, but without end. In order to help us to do our phases right, we have the pairing of people, not just parallel lives like in the ancient Plutarchian way, but very sophisticated multiple transform of that. By taking two persons, two classic examples of them in books, we handle an entire range of problems before they become problems. One thing that we're doing here is we're pairing Confucius and his book, the Analects, the Lunyu, we're ratioing it with the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The reason for this is that we began nature with the I Ching and with Thoreau. And we saw when we were going through the phase of nature that the I Ching originally was about 2950 BC, about the time that the Egyptian Book of the Dead would for the first time have been entering into a formal way the beginnings of Egyptian civilization. And the beginnings of Egyptian civilization, though they went back some 10 to 15,000 years when the Sahara was fertile, it was a grassland for a long time, like the middle part of the North American continent. And desiccation only set in about 10,000 BC. And slowly the desert encroached until there was only the Nile River Valley that was left fertile because it could renew itself every year with the inundation. Not that there was a flood of destruction, but this was a flood of the return of life. And this happened every single year. And the signal for this was that at dawn, on a very special day, the star Sirius would rise above the horizon, and that would be the sign that the inundation was coming and you could be prepared for it. If you will look at the starry expanse at night at your convenience, you will notice that the most powerful star near Sirius is a bright yellow star that's at the very top left of the constellation of Orion. And Osiris has always been not identified with Orion, but always is an emergent divinity who has a special relationship to the constellation of Orion. That large yellow star is named Betelgeuse from the Arabic, and it's an enormous supergiant. If Betelgeuse were where our sun is, the surface of Betelgeuse would be at the orbit of Mars. It is immensely massive, and it's only because it's 900 light years away that it doesn't just dominate everything. What is also interesting is that if you draw a line imaginatively to Sirius from Betelgeuse, you will notice that that line has a very specific length that is mirrored by the length from Betelgeuse to another star, which is very bright. Sirius is about 9-point-something light years away, and the other star is about the same distance away. Its name is Procyon. And the distance visually in the night sky is that there is an equilateral triangle of Betelgeuse, of Sirius, and of Procyon. And that this equilateral triangle is right away an indication that there is a geometry to the heavens. And part of the geometry to the heavens is that geometrizing gestalt for the imagination carries right over immediately into Orion of the three stars forming the belt of Orion. The three great pyramids at Giza are exactly in the same configuration of those three stars. The third one, Mintaka, is actually a double star, but we only see one from Earth. And then, of course, the sword of Orion. And then, of course, the whole configuration, because another blue-white giant, Rigel, is directly opposite of Betelgeuse. And so the diagonal from Betelgeuse through the three stars at the center to supergiant, blue giant Rigel at the bottom, you get this beginning of the way in which heaven is constellated in such a way that its geometry is visuable and is sentient before we can figure out the symbolic intelligence of it. And so very early on, the rituals of comportment were not just that one behaved on earth, but that the earth's behavior behaves also in terms of a geometricity to heaven. Confucius came 2,500 years after Fu Xi and Nu Gua, who laid the seeds of the trigrams of the I Ching. But in between, there was an epical change, as we saw, that the heavenly pattern of Fu Xi, 3000 BC, was translated 2,000 years later into the human pattern of the founding of the Joe Dynasty. Confucius came right at the period where the Joe Dynasty was finally crumbling in the period of warring states, and his whole concern was that there must be some way to have a new dynasty which would not just replace the Zhou, which had replaced the Shang, which had replaced the Xia, but there must be a way to make a new dynasty that would be everlasting, that it would never go out of sync. And the only way to do this was to take stock of the bright splendor of the vision of the Zhou dynasty at its founding, and the Confucian classic, which is that, is called the Book of Odes, or the Book of Songs. This is the great translation done in Stockholm by Bernard Karlgren about 1950. There is a good translation by Arthur Whaley that is available on the net from Grove Press paperbacks. In the Book of Songs, there are 305 songs of the splendid vision, but in Confucius's time, it wasn't the splendid poetic vision that appealed to him. It was the need to look at the ritual objectivity that could be teased out of these and put into the practice of repeatability, so that the rituals now became not just rituals, but would now become principles of action. The Chinese word for that is li, L-I. So that a new dynasty founded on li, not as eternity, that belongs to Tao. You cannot commandeer it. But what belongs to Te, the unity that emerges out of Tao, you can make your ritual comportment cycle fit exactly so that it is a unity and need never then decay. Because Te, like Tao, is a universal, not a universal energy like Tao without limit, but a universal form that emerges out of that energy that has everlastingness. And so Confucian was a very brilliant character. Said the emphasis for us then, in terms of ritual accuracy, is to make sure that the process of human-hearted experience will fit exactly into the limitless eternity of Tao, because our ritual comportment will have Te as its unifying power. And so the new dynasty will last forever. One of the figures who was convinced that this was true tried to set up a universal dynasty, and he was the founder of the Qin, or the Qin dynasty, out of which we get the term Chinese. Qin Shi Huang Ti. The greatest Chinese historian, Sima Qian, who lived about 100 BC, says this, that Qin Shi Huang Ti, trying to figure out how to make a Confucian, everlasting, permanent dynasty, issued an edict. We have heard that in high antiquity there were titles, but no posthumous names. In middle antiquity there were titles, but when people died they were provided with posthumous names in accordance with their conduct. If this is so, then it is a case of the son passing judgment on the father, and the subject passing judgment on the ruler. This is quite pointless, and we will not adopt this practice in such matters. Here, henceforward, the law on posthumous names is abolished. We are the first august emperor, and later generations will be numbered in accordance with this system. Second generation, third generation, right down to the 10,000th generation, and this tradition will continue without end. It's about 230 BC. Then he brought in a very interesting thing that had come up through the speculation of Confucius, because Confucius not only knew the original Fuxi, heavenly I Ching, and the Joe Dynasty, humanly I Ching, he added a third level to it, which are the commentaries, the 10 commentaries called the 10 Wings. And the Confucian commentaries firmly placed the fulcrum of ritual action on the ability to engender the human-heartedness that will flow with Tao, and that human-heartedness is Zhen. And so Confucius took the Tao of Fuxi, the Te of the Zhou dynasty, and not added Zhen, but made Zhen the ratioing between the Tao and the Te, so that if the Zhen is engendered pure because of principled rituals, because of exact rites that produce the cycle of everlastingness, our human-hearted Zhen will be precisely in tune with the Tao. And though we cannot easily get back to the primordiality of Fuxi or the primordiality of Lao Tzu, we can all individually cooperate together to produce a culture that everything is followed exactly. And if we do this in the balanced structure that was engendered by Confucius, everything then will run smoothly. The adoption of that formally lasted for 2,200 years in China. It only came to an end in 1911 and was consistent all the way through Chinese civilization. What is interesting for us, that the ancient Egyptian comportment in the Egyptian Book of the Dead has lasted all this time as well and has never come to an end, is still operating, but operating in such a way that the historical consciousness of it is limited to so few people, it hardly makes any impress at all, not only on intelligence of mind, but upon the larger transforms of conscious understanding. Where it maintains its impress is in the sense of sentient well-being, because one is doing the ritual cycle right. And this goes on until our own time here at the beginnings of the 21st century. Before there was an Egyptian Book of the Dead, those writings were not on papyrus rolls. Those writings, originally when they appeared on the inside of pyramids, like the Pyramid of Unas, or the Pyramid of Pepi II, or the Pyramid of Seti, so that the written language was on the inside of the tomb, the outside of which was the pyramid. And the pyramid was a very special kind of a triangle. It was a triangle that had 4 facets, 4 sides, so that its base would be a square. And the 4 triangles that would come together to an apex would be an apex of 4 times 3, or of 12 facets to it. And this square rising to the apex would be the risen center, brought geometrically to its pinnacle, its peak. And at that peak would be a place where what would be able to be beaconed would be the eternity of Re. Whereas the form of the pyramid itself would be the everlastingness of Osiris. And the first place, before there were pyramids, that this was practiced was at a sacred site in Egypt named Abydos. And in the first 2 dynasties, the central place at Abydos was the Osirian. The great monograph on it is by Margaret Murray, who is very famous, not so much for her Egyptian books now, but she was famous for her books on witchcraft and theories of witchcraft. And her books on witchcraft were the founding things of Wicca and many other things. But the Osirian at Abydos is in a very peculiar place. The Nile River has a special bend to it, and the flooding dynamic makes a very fertile patch of ground that has a very odd configuration. There are 2 huge, abutting, sharp cliffs that are spread from each other by about 15 miles, and one of these is a male cliff, the other is a female cliff, and right where the curve of not the mountain range, but it is the high plateau of the desert that is higher than the Nile Valley, where the river is and the fertile land is, there is a notch leading very easily up into, not the desert, but at Abydos, the Osirian was placed so that one was able, in the rituals within it, to go through a kind of a water baptism and an energizing of the spirit so that one could send one's deepest spirit through that notch in the pass between the male and female protective barriers. And that western land was not the desert, but was the paradise. Because the Egyptian paradise, just like the Chinese paradise, was always in the west. Why? Because in the east, at the dawning, it is an eternal dawning. But it is the sunset leading to the netherworld, leading to the night, where what occurs is not the familiar certainty of the day, but the unfamiliar, huge geometry possibilities of the starry expanse of the night. And so it is the night of heaven that is a problem for man. He can adapt his mind to the idea of eternity, even though he doesn't understand that he's doing it delusionally through an illusion. But he cannot find any way to adopt the delusion that he is of everlastingness. And so for him, the biggest punctuation that gets in the way is his death. The punctuation of this whole life as a unity is that you're dead. And so it is the penetration of the liminality of death that is the root of the problem, always. And the answer to that problem is not an answer, but it is a solution of the problem in the first place, so that the problem does not occur. There was a famous French psychiatrist, Hubert Benoit. He was Aldous Huxley's psychologist. He wrote a couple of little books. One of them is called Let Go. He used Zen koans in his psychotherapy in Paris. And he says in the very beginning of it, he said, modern man's problem is that he believes that he has a problem. Therefore, he has that problem. The answer is not to solve the problem, but to dissolve the illusion that there is a problem in the first place. Because when the problem does not occur in the first place, there is no worry that ever engenders itself. This takes, though, a very special quality as long as one clings to one's identity. As long as one has trust in identification. And that is, what if I'm wrong? What is going to happen to me? If I let go while I'm still alive, I may be subjected to pure chaos. I may go crazy. I may blank out. I may never be able to get back into things. And so the fear, not only the fear that one doesn't know what's going to happen to you, but also the fear of the ridicule of what others will think of you when they see you having let go and don't know how to do anything anymore. Confucius says right away in the Annals, in the Analects, the master said, "Is it not a pleasure, having learned something, to try it out at due intervals?" First thing, where is it tried out? It is tried out in the junctures of whatever times. And what are the times? The times are not just hours, days, and months. The times are how long it takes for this ritual to finish its objectivity, for that action that is planned to come into its being. And so the intervaling is a ritual time intervaling. And the only way that the time intervaling can be everlasting is if that ritual cycle is kept exactly in its unity. And if it does, your Zhen will be in tune with Tao, and your Te will cycle itself in return indefinitely. The ridicule is more difficult on this scale than the fear of madness or of death itself. And so Confucius ends his first little pithy saying number one in book one, "Is it not a pleasure, having learned something, to try it out at due intervals? Is it not a joy to have friends come from afar? Is it not gentlemanly not to take offense when others fail to appreciate your abilities?" Yutzu said, "It is rare for a man whose character is such that he is good as a son and obedient as a young man, to have the inclination to transgress against his superiors. It is unheard of for one who has no such inclination to be inclined to start a rebellion. The gentleman devotes his efforts to the roots, for once the roots are established, the way will grow therefrom. Being good as a son and obedient as a young man is perhaps the root of a man's character." And we're seeing in our learning that the character is that quality in our experience where sentience has its focus. It's not an identity, it's one's character. And not only do we have a character, animals have characters. Trees, plants have characters. The stars have characters. So that it is a consistency all the way through the universe that character configures experiences that can only rise not out of Tao, but out of the Te that is held together by what you do. And so ritual activity is always looking for the purpose to finish its cycle so that the objectivity occurs and then fits in due time intervals with other such rituals, other such objectivities, so that they form the completeness of the cycle, the main quality of which is that it is repeatable indefinitely. And as long as that happens, we are free within that particular ambit. Not only are we free to have the security of Te, but we are free because our Zhen will be flowing with the Tao. And this was the final point for Confucius. Just as our Zhen will flow with the Tao, our minds will structure according to the Te of the ritual cycle that is right, and our minds will be balanced. Our symbolic objectivity will not be in identification, but it will be in a harmonic. And so just as experience will be resonant with nature, our mind will be a harmonic integral of the actions that all people do. And if everyone participates together, the entirety of that social order will be that it can repeat indefinitely. At the beginning of Book 3, in order to emphasize that the wrong people doing the right things is the wrong way to go about it, Confucius said of the Qi family, they used 8 rows of 8 dancers each to perform in their courtyard. If this can be tolerated, anything can be tolerated. The 3 families, the big godfather families of that part of China at that time, the 3 families performed the Yung ceremony when the sacrificial offerings were being cleared away. The master said, Confucius, in attendance were the great lords, in solemn dignity was the emperor. What application has this to the halls of the 3 families? Yung is poem 282 in the song, a book of songs, the book of odes. It is about a ritual that can only be performed right, and this ritual is from the founding of the Joe Dynasty some 1,000 years before the time that we're hearing of. It reads this way in translation. This is Carlgren's great translation. There are those who come, very concordant. They arrive and stand, very solemn, assisting. Are the rulers and the princes. The Son of Heaven is very august. Oh, we offer the large male animal. Assist us in setting forth the sacrifice. Great was my august Father. He comforts me, his pious Son. Of all-embracing wisdom was the man. In peace and war, he was a sovereign. He appeased even the great heaven. He can make prosperous his descendants. He comforts me with a vigorous old age. His descendants enrich me with ample blessings. I wait upon my brilliant dead father and also upon my fine mothers. This ode in Confucius's time was supposed to be intoned at a very special kind of pair of sacrifices on Mount Taishan, one of the 5 holy mountains of China. Taishan is on the Shandong Peninsula where Confucius was born, not too far away from it. When an emperor wishes to celebrate himself as the Son of Heaven, he goes to the top of Taishan and performs himself, only for himself, a special ceremony that links himself to heaven. Then he comes down Mount Taishan and he performs the other side of that ceremony for the people. And these Feng and Shan ceremonies, the Shan for the mountain top, the Feng, which is the phoenix fire of renewal, so that now he has done something that Moses did. He went to the top of Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments and brought them back down and delivered them to the people. It was a pattern in China 2,000 years before Moses ever lived. It is a quality that one goes to some kind of mountain or pyramid top because at that particular focus, eternity will have a flash of its reality within the intervaling that time forms have. So that when a great age is finished, when its time form is finished, and before the new time form begins, there's an instant of eternity exactly there. And if someone is performing the connection of flowing with eternity at that particular point, what opens is the eternal eye of vision in an everlastingness. That's why on the back of the American $1 bill, you will find at the top of the pyramid is the all-seeing eye. Because that vision was well known to Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. They did the original designs behind that symbol. Follow the money. More next week.